The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of Clarence's house as Charles sat in his private study, reviewing the day's schedule. His secretary had arranged the papers neatly on his mahogany desk, but something felt different about this particular Tuesday. The air seemed heavier, charged with intention he couldn't quite place his finger on. Charles had always been a man of routine. Every morning at precisely 7:30, he would review correspondence, meet with his private secretary, and plan his royal engagements. But today, an unexpected phone call would shatter that carefully constructed routine forever. The call came from Princess and herself. Her voice, usually steady and composed, carried an edge that immediately caught Charles's attention. She had discovered something troubling, something that involved Camilla and a series of behind-the-scenes maneuvers that had been happening right under everyone's noses. "Charles, we need to talk immediately," Anne's voice crackled through the phone. "It's about Camilla, and I'm afraid you're not going to like what I have to tell you." Charles felt his stomach drop. In all his years as heir to the throne, he had learned to expect the unexpected, but the tone in his sister's voice suggested this was something entirely different. This wasn't about protocol or public relations disasters. This was personal, and it was serious, and had always been the most straightforward member of the royal family. Known for her no-nonsense approach and fierce loyalty to the crown, she rarely called emergency meetings unless something truly significant had occurred. Charles knew that whatever she had discovered, it was important enough to potentially shake the very foundations of his relationship with Camilla. The discovery had actually begun 3 weeks earlier when Anne was reviewing guest lists for upcoming royal functions. As the Princess Royal, she maintained significant influence over ceremonial events and had noticed some peculiar patterns in the invitations and arrangements for several high-profile gatherings. What started as routine oversight had quickly evolved into something much more concerning, and had discovered that Camilla had been actively working behind the scenes to limit Anne's involvement in key royal events. It wasn't just about guest lists or seating arrangements. The interference ran much deeper, touching on matters of protocol, public appearances, and even family gatherings. The evidence had been building slowly. Anne's private secretary had mentioned several instances where planned appearances had been mysteriously canceled or modified without proper consultation. Invitations that should have been extended to and were somehow overlooked or delayed. Important family meetings were scheduled at times when Anne was known to be unavailable due to prior commitments. At first, Anne had attributed these incidents to simple administrative oversights. The royal household was complex, with multiple offices coordinating thousands of events throughout the year. Mistakes happened, and had always been understanding about the occasional scheduling conflict or communication breakdown. But as the pattern continued and became more obvious, and realized this wasn't a series of innocent mistakes. Someone was deliberately working to minimize her presence and influence within the royal family structure. The realization was both shocking and deeply hurtful, especially when she began to trace the source of these interferences back to Camilla's office, and had always maintained a cordial but somewhat distant relationship with Camilla. She respected Charles's choice of wife and had publicly supported their marriage, understanding the importance of family unity. However, she had never been particularly close to Camilla on a personal level, and now she was beginning to understand why. The evidence was subtle but unmistakable. Memos from Camilla's private secretary contained suggestions for streamlining royal events by focusing on core family members. Event planners received guidance about optimizing attendance for maximum impact, which somehow always resulted in reduced roles for Anne. Communication channels that had traditionally included and were quietly restructured to bypass her office entirely. What made the situation even more troubling was the calculated nature of these actions. This wasn't the result of personal animosity or spontaneous decisions. The interference appeared to be part of a systematic campaign to diminish Anne's influence within the royal family hierarchy, and had spent considerable time documenting these incidents before deciding to approach Charles. She knew that any accusation against Camilla would need to be supported by concrete evidence, not just suspicion or hurt feelings. The relationship between Charles and Camilla was deeply important to him, and didn't want to damage that relationship unless she was absolutely certain of her facts. The documentation process had been emotionally difficult for Anne. Each piece of evidence represented another instance where she had been deliberately excluded or marginalized by someone she had tried to accept as family. The accumulation of these incidents painted a picture that was impossible to ignore or explain away as coincidence, and had also consulted with trusted advisors within the royal household, people who had served the family for decades and understood the delicate dynamics involved. Their insights confirmed her suspicions and provided additional context about the broader implications of Camilla's actions. The interference wasn't just affecting Anne personally. It was disrupting the carefully balanced ecosystem of royal responsibilities and potentially undermining the effectiveness of the monarchy as an institution. Each member of the royal family had specific roles and responsibilities that contributed to the overall success of their public service. When those roles were artificially constrained or eliminated, the entire system suffered. As Anne prepared for her conversation with Charles, she struggled with the emotional weight of what she was about to reveal. She knew that her brother loved Camilla deeply and that this information would be devastating to him. At the same time, she felt a responsibility to protect the integrity of the royal family and ensure that all members could fulfill their duties without interference. The decision to approach Charles directly rather than handling the matter through private secretaries or other intermediaries was deliberate, and believed that something this serious required a face-to-face conversation between siblings, away from the formal protocols that usually governed royal communications. She had chosen her words carefully, planning exactly how to present the evidence without seeming vindictive or petty. The goal wasn't to destroy Charles's relationship with Camilla, but to ensure that he was fully aware of what was happening behind the scenes in his name, and also recognized that Charles might initially react with disbelief or defensiveness. The allegations against Camilla were serious, and it would be natural for him to want to protect his wife from what might seem like unfair criticism, and prepared herself for the possibility that Charles might not immediately accept her evidence or might need time to process the information before taking action. The phone call that Tuesday morning was the culmination of weeks of careful preparation and internal debate, and had wrestled with whether to bring these concerns forward, knowing the potential consequences for family relationships and public perception. But ultimately, her sense of duty and commitment to the royal family's mission had compelled her to act. As Charles listened to his sister's urgent voice on the phone, he had no idea that his world was about to be turned upside down. The comfortable routine of his morning, the familiar surroundings of his study, and his confidence in his understanding of family dynamics were all about to be challenged in ways he had never imagined possible. The conversation that followed would mark the beginning of a crisis that would test not only Charles's relationship with Camilla, but also his ability to navigate the complex political dynamics within his own family. The revelations Anne was about to share would force Charles to confront uncomfortable truths about the woman he loved and the ways in which personal relationships could become entangled with institutional responsibilities. Charles's initial reaction was one of confusion rather than alarm. He had always trusted Camilla completely and found it difficult to imagine that she would engage in the kind of systematic interference Anne was describing. His first instinct was to assume that there had been some kind of misunderstanding or that the incidents Anne had noticed could be explained by administrative complications rather than deliberate actions. But as Anne began to present her evidence in detail, Charles felt a growing sense of unease. The patterns she described were too consistent and too targeted to be dismissed as coincidence. The documentation she had compiled was thorough and convincing, leaving little room for alternative explanations. The conversation stretched on for nearly an hour as Anne methodically walked through each incident, providing context and evidence for her conclusions. Charles found himself taking notes, asking questions, and gradually coming to terms with the possibility that his wife had been working against his sister without his knowledge or consent. By the end of the call, Charles was experiencing a complex mix of emotions. There was shock at the scope of Camilla's interference, hurt at being kept in the dark about these activities, and anger at the potential damage to family relationships and royal duties. But there was also a deep sadness at the realization that someone he trusted completely had apparently been engaged in behavior that undermined his values and principles. As he hung up the phone, Charles sat in his study for a long time, staring out the window at the London skyline and trying to process what he had just learned. The comfortable certainties of his morning routine seemed like a distant memory, replaced by a new reality that demanded immediate attention and careful consideration. Charles spent the next 3 days in a state of internal turmoil that he had never experienced before. The evidence Anne had presented was overwhelming, but he needed to verify everything himself before confronting Camilla. The thought of his wife deliberately working against his sister felt like a betrayal not just of family bonds, but of everything he believed about their relationship. He began his own quiet investigation, reviewing correspondence and meeting minutes from the past several months. What he discovered made his stomach churn. The pattern of interference was even more extensive than Anne had realized. Camilla's influence extended beyond just excluding Anne from events. She had been systematically positioning herself as the primary female royal figure, often at the expense of other family members. Charles found memos in which Camilla's office had suggested that certain royal duties should be consolidated for efficiency. These suggestions invariably resulted in responsibilities being transferred from and to Camilla. Public appearances that had traditionally involved multiple royal family members were being redesigned to highlight Camilla's role while diminishing others. The most disturbing discovery came when Charles accessed email correspondence between Camilla's private secretary and various event coordinators. The messages revealed a deliberate strategy to gradually reduce Anne's public profile while elevating Camilla's status within the royal hierarchy. The language was carefully crafted to appear reasonable and practical, but the intent was unmistakable. One particular email exchange made Charles's hands shake with anger. Camilla's secretary had written to the coordinator of a major charity event, suggesting that given the Queen Consort's increasing responsibilities, it might be more appropriate to have a single senior royal representative rather than diluting the impact with multiple family members. The charity had reluctantly agreed, resulting in Anne's invitation being withdrawn just days before the event. Charles realized that this wasn't just about sibling rivalry or personality conflicts. This was about power, influence, and control within the royal family structure. Camilla appeared to be orchestrating a systematic campaign to position herself as the dominant female figure in the monarchy, regardless of established protocols or family relationships. The emotional impact of these discoveries was devastating for Charles. He had always prided himself on being a good judge of character, and he had believed that Camilla shared his values of service, humility, and family loyalty. The evidence he was uncovering suggested that she had been pursuing her own agenda while presenting a completely different face to him personally. Charles began to question everything about their relationship. Had Camilla been manipulating him from the beginning? Were her expressions of support for family unity genuine? Or were they part of a calculated strategy to gain his trust while working against his siblings? The uncertainty was agonizing, and Charles found himself unable to sleep or concentrate on his regular duties. The situation became even more complicated when Charles discovered that Camilla's interference extended beyond just Anne. There were subtle attempts to limit the roles of other family members as well, particularly Prince Edward and Sophie. The pattern suggested a comprehensive strategy to centralize royal influence around Charles and Camilla, with other family members relegated to supporting roles. Charles also learned that several senior staff members within the royal household had noticed these patterns but had been hesitant to bring them to his attention. The delicate nature of family dynamics and the potential for misunderstanding had made them reluctant to voice concerns about the Queen Consort's activities. This revelation added another layer of frustration for Charles, who realized that the problem had been visible to others long before he became aware of it. The evidence continued to mount as Charles dug deeper into the administrative records. He found instances where charitable organizations had been pressured to choose between different royal patrons, with strong hints that selecting Camilla would be viewed more favorably by the palace. He discovered that media interviews and photo opportunities were being strategically managed to maximize Camilla's exposure while minimizing others. Perhaps most troubling of all, Charles found evidence that Camilla had been working to influence the guest list for private family gatherings as well as public events. Christmas celebrations, birthday parties, and other personal occasions have been subtly managed to reduce its presence and prominence within the family circle. The realization that this interference extended into their private family life was a breaking point for Charles. He could potentially understand strategic decisions about public appearances and official duties, even if he disagreed with the methods. But the idea that Camilla had been manipulating their personal relationships crossed a line that Charles found unforgivable. As the full scope of Camilla's actions became clear, Charles struggled with how to respond. His first instinct was to confront her immediately and demand an explanation. But he also recognized that this was a delicate situation that could have far-reaching consequences for the monarchy if it wasn't handled carefully. Charles decided to seek advice from his most trusted confidants before taking any direct action. He arranged discreet meetings with senior advisors who had served the royal family for decades, people whose judgment he respected and whose discretion he could count on. These conversations provided additional perspective on the situation. Several advisors confirmed that they had noticed unusual patterns in royal scheduling and protocol, but had attributed them to the natural adjustments that occur when new people join the family. Others admitted that they had suspected something was amiss, but had hesitated to speak up without concrete evidence. The advisors also helped Charles understand the broader implications of Camilla's actions. The royal family's effectiveness depended on careful coordination and mutual support among its members. When one person began working against others, it undermined the entire institution and could potentially damage public confidence in the monarchy. Charles learned that some organizations and institutions had begun to express confusion about royal protocol and priorities. The mixed messages and conflicting guidance from different offices within the palace were creating uncertainty about how to properly interact with the royal family. This administrative chaos was starting to affect the monarchy's ability to fulfill its ceremonial and charitable functions effectively. The political implications were equally concerning. The royal family's role in British society depended on their ability to present a united front and demonstrate stable leadership. Internal conflicts and power struggles could provide ammunition for Republican critics and potentially weaken public support for the monarchy as an institution. Charles also had to consider the impact on and personally. His sister had dedicated her entire adult life to royal service, and she deserved to be treated with respect and dignity within the family structure. The systematic campaign to marginalize her was not only unfair, but also wasteful of her considerable talents and experience. As Charles processed all of this information, he began to experience physical symptoms of stress that he had never encountered before. He developed headaches, had difficulty sleeping, and found himself unable to maintain his usual composed demeanor during public appearances. His staff began to notice changes in his behavior, though they were too discreet to ask direct questions about the cause. The emotional toll was perhaps even more significant than the physical symptoms. Charles felt betrayed, confused, and angry in ways that challenged his usually calm and measured approach to problems. He found himself questioning not just Camilla's actions, but his own judgment and leadership abilities. The crisis also forced Charles to confront uncomfortable questions about power dynamics within his own marriage. Had he been naive to assume that Camilla shared his values and priorities? Had his love for her blinded him to warning signs that others might have recognized? The possibility that he had been manipulated by someone he trusted completely was deeply humiliating. Charles began to realize that this situation would require him to make some very difficult decisions about his relationship with Camilla and his responsibilities as future king. The evidence of her interference with and was clear and undeniable. The question was what to do about it, and how to prevent similar problems in the future. The weight of these decisions was enormous. Charles knew that whatever action he took would have consequences not just for his personal relationships, but for the monarchy as an institution. The public nature of royal life meant that family conflicts couldn't be resolved privately without consideration of their broader impact. As he prepared for what would inevitably be a confrontational conversation with Camilla, Charles tried to steel himself for the difficult questions and painful emotions that lay ahead. The comfortable assumptions that had guided his relationship with his wife were about to be challenged in the most fundamental way possible. The confrontation Charles had been dreading finally took place on a gray Thursday evening at Highgrove House. He had carefully chosen the location, wanting the conversation to happen in a private setting where they could speak freely without the formal constraints of official residences or the presence of staff members who might overhear sensitive discussions. Charles had spent hours preparing for this conversation, reviewing his evidence and planning his approach. He knew that Camilla was intelligent and articulate, and he expected her to have explanations or justifications for her actions. He also knew that their marriage and their future together would depend on how this conversation unfolded. When Camilla arrived for what she believed was a routine dinner, Charles could see that she sensed something was wrong. His demeanor was more formal than usual, and he had arranged for them to eat in his private study rather than the dining room. The change in routine immediately put Camilla on alert, though she tried to maintain normal conversation during the meal. After dinner, Charles closed the door to his study and asked Camilla to sit down. The seriousness of his tone made it clear that this wasn't going to be an ordinary evening conversation. Charles had decided to present the evidence systematically, starting with the most recent incidents and working backward to show the pattern of interference. Camilla's initial reaction was one of surprise and denial. She claimed that any scheduling conflicts or protocol changes had been the result of administrative decisions made by her staff without her direct involvement. She suggested that Charles was misinterpreting routine coordination between different royal offices as something more sinister than it actually was. But as Charles continued to present specific examples, including email correspondence and documented meeting minutes, Camilla's explanations became less convincing. The evidence was too detailed and too extensive to be dismissed as miscommunication or staff errors. Charles could see that Camilla was beginning to realize the serious nature of the accusations and the strength of the evidence against her. The turning point came when Charles showed Camilla the email exchange about the charity event that had resulted in Anne's invitation being withdrawn. The language in the correspondence was so clearly deliberate and strategic that Camilla couldn't maintain her claims of innocence or lack of awareness. For several long minutes, Camilla sat in silence, clearly struggling with how to respond. Charles could see a range of emotions crossing her face: anger, fear, embarrassment, and what might have been shame. When she finally spoke, her approach surprised him completely. Instead of continuing to deny her involvement or offering apologies, Camilla went on the offensive. She accused Charles of being naive about the political realities of royal life and suggested that his loyalty to his family was preventing him from making necessary strategic decisions about the monarchy's future. Camilla argued that Anne had become increasingly irrelevant to the public and that concentrating royal duties among fewer, more prominent family members would improve the institution's efficiency and public appeal. She claimed that her actions had been motivated by genuine concern for the monarchy's long-term success rather than personal ambition or rivalry. This response shocked Charles more than the original evidence of interference had. He had expected denials, explanations, or even apologies, but he hadn't anticipated that Camilla would defend her actions as being in the monarchy's best interests. The revelation that she genuinely believed her interference was justified added a new dimension to the crisis. Charles found himself struggling to respond to Camilla's arguments. While he disagreed completely with her assessment of Anne's value and her methods of pursuing change, he could see that Camilla had convinced herself that her actions were strategically sound. This wasn't just about personal rivalry or family dynamics. It was about fundamentally different philosophies regarding how the royal family should operate. The conversation became increasingly heated as Charles challenged Camilla's assumptions and defended his contributions to royal duties. Camilla became more aggressive in her arguments, suggesting that Charles was too emotionally attached to his family to make objective decisions about institutional needs. Camilla went further, claiming that and had been deliberately undermining Camilla's authority as queen consort, and that the interference had been a defensive response to Anne's own manipulations. She provided examples of times when Anne had failed to follow proper protocol in dealing with Camilla's office or had made decisions without appropriate consultation. Charles recognized that some of Camilla's complaints about Anne might have validity, but he was appalled by the scope and systematic nature of her response. Even if Anne had occasionally been difficult to work with, Camilla's campaign of interference was far out of proportion to any provocation she might have received. As the argument continued, Charles began to see a side of Camilla that he had never encountered before. Her usual charm and diplomatic skill gave way to a harder, more calculating personality that focused ruthlessly on power and position. The woman he thought he knew seemed to disappear, replaced by someone who viewed royal service primarily as a competition to be won rather than a duty to be fulfilled. Camilla's defense of her actions also revealed the extent to which she had been planning and implementing these strategies. This wasn't the result of impulse or emotion. It was a carefully considered campaign that had been ongoing for months or possibly years. The realization that Camilla had been deceiving him for so long was devastating for Charles. The conversation reached a crisis point when Camilla demanded that Charles choose between supporting her vision for the monarchy's future or continuing to enable what she characterized as an obsolete approach to royal duties. The ultimatum was delivered with a confidence that suggested Camilla believed Charles would ultimately side with his wife over his sister. Charles was stunned by the demand that he choose sides in what Camilla was now openly acknowledging as a power struggle within the family. He had never viewed royal service in terms of competition or political maneuvering, and the idea that his wife expected him to participate in undermining his own sister was profoundly disturbing. The shock of realizing how completely he had misunderstood Camilla's motivations and methods began to manifest in physical symptoms that Charles couldn't control. His hands began to shake, his breathing became labored, and he felt a crushing sensation in his chest that made it difficult to continue the conversation. Camilla seemed to recognize that Charles was experiencing some kind of medical episode, but rather than showing concern or calling for help, she continued to press her arguments. She appeared to interpret his distress as a sign that he was beginning to accept the validity of her position and was struggling with the implications for his relationship with Anne. Charles tried to stand up from his chair, but found that his legs wouldn't support him properly. The combination of emotional shock and physical stress had overwhelmed his system in a way that he had never experienced before. He managed to reach his desk phone and called for his personal physician, though he struggled to speak clearly enough to explain the nature of the emergency. Dr. Patterson arrived within 20 minutes and immediately recognized that Charles was experiencing a severe stress reaction that could potentially develop into something more serious if not properly managed. He administered medication to help stabilize Charles's vital signs and recommended immediate rest and monitoring. Throughout the medical emergency, Camilla remained in the study, but her focus seemed to be more on the interrupted conversation than on Charles's health. She repeatedly tried to continue their discussion even as Dr. Patterson was treating Charles, apparently believing that she could still convince him to support her position. The physician finally had to ask Camilla to leave the room so that Charles could rest without additional stress. Her reluctance to comply and her continued attempts to justify her actions, even in the face of Charles's medical crisis, revealed a level of self-absorption that shocked everyone present. As Charles lay on the couch in his study, with Dr. Patterson monitoring his pulse and blood pressure, he tried to process what had just happened. The conversation with Camilla had revealed not just evidence of interference with Anne, but a fundamental disconnect between his understanding of their relationship and the reality of Camilla's motivations and character. The physical symptoms Charles was experiencing, the racing heart, difficulty breathing, and overwhelming sense of disorientation, were manifestations of psychological shock that went far beyond simple surprise or disappointment. He was confronting the possibility that his marriage was based on a fundamental misunderstanding and that the person he loved and trusted most had been systematically deceiving him. Dr. Patterson stayed with Charles for several hours, monitoring his condition and providing mild sedation to help him rest. The physician had seen stress reactions before, but the severity of Charles's symptoms suggested that whatever had triggered this episode was extraordinarily traumatic on a personal level. As the medication began to take effect and Charles's vital signs stabilized, he found himself drifting in and out of consciousness. But even in his drugged state, he couldn't escape the memory of Camilla's cold calculation and her apparent lack of concern for his health during their confrontation. The woman he had married seemed like a stranger, and Charles wasn't sure if their relationship could survive this fundamental revelation about her character. The aftermath of Charles's shock-induced medical episode sent ripples throughout the royal household that couldn't be contained despite efforts at discretion. Dr. Patterson had insisted on 24-hour monitoring, which meant that senior staff members became aware that something serious had occurred, even if they weren't privy to the specific details, and arrived at Highgrove House within hours of being notified about her brother's condition. The official explanation was that Charles had experienced a stress-related episode following intensive work commitments, and immediately suspected that their recent conversation about Camilla's interference had played a role in triggering his collapse. Charles was in no condition to discuss the confrontation with Camilla for the first 2 days following the incident. Dr. Patterson had prescribed complete rest and minimal stress, which meant that all official engagements were canceled and visitors were strictly limited, and spent those days coordinating with senior staff to ensure that royal duties continued to be fulfilled while Charles recovered. During this period, and noticed that Camilla's behavior was strikingly different from what might have been expected given her husband's medical emergency. Rather than staying close to provide support and comfort, Camilla seemed more focused on controlling information about the incident and managing how it was being communicated within the royal household and to the media, and observed Camilla holding multiple private meetings with her personal staff and communications advisors, conversations that seemed to be more about damage control than about Charles's health. There was a calculated quality to Camilla's response that struck and as inappropriate given the circumstances, and it reinforced her suspicions about Camilla's true priorities and motivations. When Charles was finally well enough to have serious conversations and found him profoundly changed by his experience, the confident, decisive man she had known all her life seemed shaken to his core, questioning fundamental assumptions about his judgment and relationships that had guided his decisions for decades. Charles told and about his confrontation with Camilla, including the shocking revelation that Camilla not only admitted to interfering within his role, but defended her actions as strategically necessary, and was appalled by Camilla's response. But she was even more concerned about the impact this betrayal was having on her brother's mental and emotional state. The conversation revealed that Charles's shock had been triggered not just by Camilla's admission of guilt, but by the recognition that he had been living with a fundamental misunderstanding of his wife's character and motivations. The woman he thought he had married, someone who shared his values of service, loyalty, and family unity, appeared to have been largely a creation of his own imagination. Charles confided to, and that he was struggling with feelings of humiliation and self-doubt that went far beyond this specific incident. If he had been so completely wrong about someone so close to him, how could he trust his judgment about anything else? The crisis was undermining his confidence in his ability to serve effectively as king when the time came, and recognized that her brother was experiencing something far more serious than disappointment or anger about Camilla's actions. The systematic nature of Camilla's deception had created a psychological crisis that threatened Charles's fundamental sense of reality and self-worth, and knew that this situation required extremely careful handling to prevent permanent damage to Charles's emotional stability. Working with Dr. Patterson and other trusted advisors, and helped Charles understand that his reaction was a normal response to an extraordinary betrayal rather than evidence of weakness or poor judgment on his part. The shock he had experienced was the natural result of discovering that someone he loved and trusted had been systematically deceiving him for an extended period. As Charles began to process the situation more clearly, he started to recognize other patterns in his relationship with Camilla that he had previously overlooked or misinterpreted. Her tendency to isolate him from certain family members, her subtle criticisms of his siblings and their contributions, and her consistent promotion of her own interests had all been present, but disguised as legitimate concerns or strategic thinking. The realization that the deception had been so comprehensive and long-lasting was perhaps even more traumatic than the original discovery of interference with Anne. Charles began to understand that virtually every aspect of his relationship with Camilla would need to be reevaluated in light of what he now knew about her true character and motivations. Charles also had to confront the institutional implications of Camilla's actions and his own response to them. As future king, he had a responsibility to ensure that the monarchy operated effectively and fairly for all family members who contributed to its mission. Allowing Camilla's interference to continue would undermine the institution and potentially damage relationships that were essential to royal service. The decision about how to respond to Camilla's actions was complicated by the public nature of their relationship and the potential impact on the monarchy's reputation. A public confrontation or separation would inevitably become a media sensation that could damage the institution Charles was dedicated to serving, and provided crucial support during this decision-making process, helping Charles understand that protecting the monarchy sometimes required making difficult personal sacrifices. She also helped him recognize that addressing Camilla's behavior was not just about their family relationships, but about maintaining the integrity and effectiveness of royal service. Charles spent weeks consulting with constitutional experts, senior advisors, and trusted confidants about how to handle the situation. The consensus was that Camilla's interference could not be allowed to continue, but that any response would need to be carefully managed to minimize damage to the monarchy's public standing. The solution that emerged involved a comprehensive restructuring of royal duties and protocols that would effectively prevent future interference while allowing Charles and Camilla to maintain their public relationship. Camilla's role would be more clearly defined and limited, with specific safeguards to ensure that other family members could fulfill their duties without obstruction. Charles also insisted on private conversations with each family member who had been affected by Camilla's actions. These discussions were emotionally difficult, but necessary to repair relationships and rebuild trust that had been damaged by the systematic interference. The conversation with Anne was particularly important, as Charles needed to acknowledge the injustice she had experienced and ensure that her contributions to royal service would be properly recognized and protected going forward. Anne's gracious response to his apologies and her willingness to move forward constructively helped Charles begin to rebuild his confidence in family relationships. The long-term impact of this crisis extended far beyond the immediate resolution of the interference issue. Charles's experience of being so completely deceived by someone he trusted had fundamentally changed his approach to relationships and decision-making. He developed new protocols for ensuring that he received accurate information from multiple sources and wasn't overly dependent on any single advisor or confidant. Charles also emerged from the crisis with a deeper understanding of the complex dynamics within the royal family and the ways in which personal relationships could become entangled with institutional responsibilities. He developed a more systematic approach to managing these dynamics that helped prevent similar problems from arising in the future. The incident also strengthened Charles's relationship with Anne, as they worked together to address the immediate crisis and develop long-term solutions for preventing similar interference. Anne's loyalty and support during this difficult period reminded Charles of the importance of family bonds that were based on genuine trust and shared values. Perhaps most importantly, the crisis forced Charles to confront his own vulnerabilities and develop better mechanisms for protecting himself from manipulation or deception. While the experience had been traumatic, it ultimately made him a stronger and more effective leader who was better prepared for the complex challenges of modern monarchy. The resolution of the immediate crisis didn't eliminate all the emotional and psychological effects of Charles's shock and betrayal. He continued to work with counselors and advisors to process the experience and develop healthy coping strategies for the ongoing challenges of royal life. Camilla's role within the royal family was permanently altered by these events, though the changes were implemented gradually and diplomatically to avoid public attention. She continued to fulfill certain ceremonial duties, but her influence over royal scheduling and protocol was severely limited, and her interactions with other family members were carefully monitored. The relationship between Charles and Camilla never fully recovered from the crisis, though they maintained their public partnership for institutional reasons. The trust and intimacy that had characterized their marriage was irreparably damaged by the revelation of Camilla's systematic deception and her callous response to Charles's medical emergency. In the years that followed, Charles often reflected on this period as a defining moment in his preparation for kingship. The crisis had tested his judgment, his emotional resilience, and his commitment to family unity in ways that no other experience had. While it had been deeply painful, it had also taught him valuable lessons about leadership, trust, and the complex responsibilities of royal service. Anne's role within the royal family was not only restored, but enhanced as a result of the crisis. Her grace under pressure and her loyalty to both the institution and her family members earned her increased respect and influence. She became one of Charles's most trusted advisors and played a crucial role in helping him navigate the complex challenges of preparing for his eventual role as king. The entire episode served as a reminder that even the most privileged and protected families face complex interpersonal challenges that can threaten their unity and effectiveness. The royal family's ability to address these challenges constructively while maintaining their public service mission demonstrated the resilience and adaptability that had allowed the monarchy to survive and thrive for centuries.